Okay, here's a new archaeological site that just got released here recently, showing there's an ancient circle that had been kept sacred by people going through quite a few generations of time. You can kind of make out this circle that's right here, and apparently this goes along with the earliest of dating that they have, which is over 6,000 years old. But they also have it carrying through, it seems, to the Copper Age, and then another occupation on this exact site during the Iron Age, and then again by the Anglo Saxons. There are reasons for that, and I'll kind of get into it here a little later, but this is one thing that shows a verification of sacred sites by a lot of people that you really wouldn't think that are interconnected had that connection, and whenever they recognized a sacred site, they utilized it over and over again. Quite often in the Middle East, it's left us with things that we call tells and mounds and so on, but this is in a field and really right next to a highway, so if there was any mounding at one time, it's all been flattened out long ago, but it still shows the impression. I can't get a lot of information on this, but from what I understand, they knew about this site but have been putting it off, and the locals there wanted to build a shopping center onto it, and so they said, well, sure you can, but you have to wait till they do the archaeology on it, so let's do that. And again, this is in Biddenham in Bedfordshire, England, so it's among the shires. If you look at this, my first impression is that things don't really line up too well. But I think that's my first impression after looking at the other pictures here. For I don't think this is lined up to perfect north or anything that's on here. In fact, it looks like it's definitely off from that situation. And there's not a perfect clock face, but that's not always there, for sometimes they're going with solstices and so on, and so it puts it off a little bit. But I don't think we're headed towards the north in any way. And if you just look at simple things like, hand to God, if you just look at simple things like this pit and you were to go straight across the middle, which I think has to do with this pole or scratch in the ground that's there, and you go straight across it, that's really going to point to about my finger here and not this side here, so there's something there. For that's not really 9 o'clock, that's really 8 o'clock-ish. And so if that's 8 o'clock-ish, then there's going to be a 2 o'clock up here between the 1 and 3, if you will. So there's probably more to dig out of here. And from what I understand, they basically cleared this land, checking all for surface stuff, and then they cleared it and then shaved it off to where it's just a dirt field ready to go, and they haven't done any depth to it at all. And these people who had already had LiDAR and things going on came back in with the ground penetrating radar and found these sites, and this is the big anomaly that shows up. But there are quite a few, and each one showed different occupations, and it's all just right here in this hub, which is off of A428 right there in Bedfordshire in Biddenham. And so if you look at the way they cross each other, it really seems like, well, first of all, if you look at the shadows that are everywhere, one could tell that the sun is probably here direct south, down there, because you can see the edging in certain ones, and so the sun would have to be at this point creating it from off those lines there. But also the reason I think these are off somewhat is that, well, you can see this person here and how small he is, and he's digging that way right now on that wall. And later you'll see an effect where they do this. It seems like it's a great idea whenever you're finding a certain anomaly that may be somewhat small that's sticking out over the fact that this was a circle that they could discern. There's something weird right here, like this is 3 o'clock or whatever, if you will. And so they come to about 3:15, 3:20, and they dig into the ground here, and then they dig back into it, and as they do, they're looking at the layering and the stratigraphy that's there. And so that allows you to make better assumptions what's going on and so on, but also to catch it all, and not to catch it all from the top and then trying to do a test bit next to it. You've already got that going on, all that stuff, right? And you can see this is happening all around the place, and these people are small. So looking at it, just a guesstimation here, because I, again, can't get the other information on it. I found about 6 sites talking on it, and they're all talking about the information that's listed below that we'll go over in just a minute. But this appears to be about 10 foot wide of the, border that's going all the way around this thing here. And as compared to the people, they're a little more than half of that width probably. And so the guesstimation across this thing would be basically about 100 foot to the inside perimeter of it, and outside to outside maybe 120. Wouldn't it be neat if it was 108? And that would go with sacred geometry, because this is showing something at 6,000 years ago in this area that's hooked up with sacred geometry, linking again the stars to the earth and heavens, if you will, to the earth, and making that bond. If you look here, you can see it's scratched a few places, like through here and through here, and this is where it looks like the greater thing has come along and just kind of scalped it off for them. Took the crap right off the very surface of it, but left everything else alone. But I don't know if you'll see it in here very easily, but if this is 10 foot wide, can you see this line that's here, and then a line that's here, and it's inside the circle? And it seems like it ends at a point that's here that may be about the same width as it in between there. So 10 and then 10 more, and that's where it is. And it really seems to me that it almost shows up to come down to here and be about exactly the distance between there, and then come down here. And so we end up with something that looks a little squared off. But the more I look at it, I start to see things, and I don't know if this is just from scarring on the ground or what, but there looks like there's 3 little squares right here, 3 little buildings. Really 2, and then a smaller one. Ooh, is that Orion or something? It just looks like buildings. And then over here, there's a circular pattern here and here. And they do talk about a tower, so I wonder if this had anything to do with it, or if it's totally separate. Again, I can't get the layout of it and what's north, south, east, west, or anything at this point. This is just the preliminary, okay? And that could easily be some kid went out there and did a donut or something from equipment that they used, or who knows what. It could look round because everybody's dumping their dirt there and sifting it through, and it's made its own little mound there, and you can't really tell it in the picture. But all of these seem to be crisscrossing from each other. You get this one that attaches across, so you get across, across, across. It's really pretty much on, and especially if you dug through that in this direction, now all of a sudden that does go across to the other one. This pit looks like it's off here, but it's just because it's kicked and it's not pointing right. Boom, and then now this pit, which has been dug out big right here, they're going that way now, right, against that wall? Because that's where they're looking for. But there may have been some other anomaly right here. Or they may have dug it out to make it just easier to walk down into, because it sure looks like this one here made that little walk into it and then dig and go. So let's look into this sacred site that hooks up in ideas of farming, agriculture, sacred geometry, and so on. This just came out 17th of August 2021. Sacred farming, huge monument find showcases Neolithic earth worship. Archaeologists excavating near the village of Biddenham in Bedfordshire, England, have uncovered several ancient structures dating back 6,000 years, but most recently a huge ritualistic monument has emerged from the time-worn fields. The team have uncovered several layers of archaeology dating back to the Neolithic. Bronze Age, Iron Age, and Saxon period artifacts have also been discovered by the archaeologists from Albion Archaeology, working with excavators from RPS Consulting Services. So this is a correlation too when we talked about those ancient tells that are all around, much like Göbekli Tepe was just a little pregnant hill. This had been flattened out, and we've seen a lot of sites, especially across Neolithic Europe, that have been flattened out and are really in somebody's crop field now. But if you'll fly over the top of it, especially whenever it rained not too long ago, but it is in a drought, you'll notice that it hangs around rocks and structures, and somehow it'll just reveal it like, what's that? This was one of those things. At first it was assumed to be a standalone farming settlement, but now, a vast ceremonial monument having been discovered, it is suspected that this site served ancient cultures as a sacred agricultural center, where fertility rites were most probably practiced for thousands of years. So we can talk about the rites of spring, the pitch of winter, and the death of winter whenever it dies in December 21st, and then 3 days later it magically starts rising again, and so on. This goes with shadows. So that idea we were looking at just a minute ago could become a sundial. You can put an Asherah pole right there in the center of that, and due to the casting of the shadows and the way of the sun, you can depict that out. In fact, one real neat thing about that is, if you want to actually find out where true east and west is, no matter where you are on the planet, no matter what time of the year really, if you're to stick a pole in the ground, try to make it straight up and down, stick anything like that, and you were to catch the morning sunlight and come up and start making a good shadow, and mark a dot on the ground exactly where that is, and the edge of it too, at a certain distance from the tree, and then wait till sun's going down and mark it on the other side. In fact, a better way is to wait till the sun's up 4 fingers, so about an hour, and as it starts to rise over the top of your finger here and you see just a little bit of it, you mark it. And then when you get on the other side, when it goes down and all you see is that niche to where you can, and it goes away, then you'd be like, okay, and mark it on the other side. And if you draw a line, or take a line and run it from that point to that point of the shadow, no matter what place you are on the planet, you'll actually be showing to be east-west exactly. We know how to make true north too, and Sirius and the pole star and the way that works out. But you look at the ancient Sumerians, and they weren't even doing it in the easiest possible way that could be off by a little bit, but real accurate. In fact, the Egyptians, which they always try to write off as, yeah, they tried and they just got lucky as hell. It's funny how they had a couple of people try and they thought they had done it better, and they were off by twice as far whenever they thought they had even done it better. So these sacred rites that go along with this, like Stonehenge, it was a place where everybody talked about the Druids, where they're going, and all these ceremonial things that went on. Not Samhain alone, of course, that everybody knows about, with the festival of Halloween, but all of the other festivals too, Beltane and things that go along with it that carry throughout the year. That really, to this day, we have things that carry us throughout the year, and things that match up, and Thanksgiving and all these other things seem to match up because we're still keeping it, because it still goes with it. It was amazing that they made this up. Well, they didn't make it up. They just recognized that it existed and went with it. People don't really catch it, but it's almost sacred, like the elves, where they were working with the things and the way they were all working with everything else. Yeah, it's philosophically deep. Let's just leave that alone here. Farming in the shadow of the gods. Ian Leslie from Albion Archaeology told the BBC that the researchers also discovered evidence of an Iron Age settlement, and this post-Neolithic phase of use included a roundhouse and several storage pits. And they would put these storage pits down in the ground, and of course, like a cellar or whatever, it would keep it cool. It's the first refrigerators, if you will, and it worked pretty good. That worked out even in the Middle East and in the desert quite well. Here you can see people digging in these pits, and what it might look funny to you is that they're half circles. And these people are all in the half circles. But if you noticed, most of them, except for the guy over here, which is digging down and putting stuff into the bucket, are all facing against this flat wall, because they figured the anomalies on the ground are right there. And what they're doing, I believe here, is they dig a pit beside it, and then they dig into that And by digging into it, they can really start to see what they've got. And so this is the Iron Age pits found at the site. It makes you wonder if they ever found somebody else's site and so on. Well, I'm guaranteeing that they did, and the fact that they did ensured the fact that they should live here too and continue on. Even though something inside you would tell that it all went to ruin, something was bad. Perhaps at this time they had a hint at what all went on before, and they were replacing what had went on before even somehow. And coming in and paying homage to an idea like this, because we find these stone circles all the way from Arkham and other sites way over into the deepest reaches of Asia, some down into Africa, and Egypt's got Duda and the sites that are there. These sacred stone circles that people used whenever they were bringing farming in places. And it's not like, people might say, well, when they brought it, they did this thing. Well, that's true, but they needed that thing so they can set up the whole clock. They kind of need Big Ben right there in the middle of big city so they can keep up with the whole thing. And it's got to have big enough chimes so people can tell when goes what. You can set your clocks by it, because people are really trying to keep up with it with Big Ben. Other things go back way, way far, but saving seed grain and preserving it over winter for sowing in the spring was perhaps the number one vulnerability in an ancient agricultural-based society. Thus, the entire process of growing, harvesting, and saving wheat seeds was deeply ritualized, for without the blessing of the gods, rats, mold, and frost might also destroy one's grain stores that you have, bringing about a local or even a regional disaster. You can imagine if you had a thing like that and it was really regional disaster, like anytime you have a drought, it rarely affects you and not the person that you know of that's just right over there. I could think of a few circumstances it would, but it might affect the whole area, and in doing so, they might go one way, you might go another way, and if it continued on, you might actually just root up and leave and go to those places that you'd went before that might still be working well. It was forced migrations, if you will. Did Neolithic dairy farmers try to butter up the gods? That might be interesting. I'll look into it for y'all. Leslie said that among the most unexpected discoveries was the presence of relatively extensive Anglo-Saxon remains, including a sunken featured building and several contemporary structures, in addition to an oven for baking bread or drying out grain, perhaps toasting barley and so on, making some beer, or all the above, These features all represent advancements from the Iron Age, which in turn came from the Neolithic period. However, what didn't change much over the almost 5,000 years of occupation was the dependence on the massive ceremonial circle at this site. So what we're really kind of indicating here is that somebody had made one of these ancient circles, and because it was right enough, whenever they found it, they utilized it again and again. We don't necessarily do this anymore. We've got our calendars all set up, and so we really don't worship at these places anymore, but Druidic things have come back into play and so on. When I was at that ranch that I told you about working for a while, I found that one of the guys working there that we really trusted for when we were sowing everything in the fields and stuff, and what days to do it on, he worked off an almanac, and he was coming into the full moon and doing this, and the third full moon of a year, and this, that, and the other, and going off of it. And I said, when they come up with that? And he goes, actually, the Druids had a big hand in it, but apparently it goes before that, but they kind of figured it out. Somehow they used to feed the animals the grain that they were supposed to eat, and they would kill them and look at their intestines, the way the grain worked out into them, and they would know this is the day. And there was even stated that whenever you planted before it and after it, if you did it right on that day and just a hair after, it would do better than the ones just before. Like if you shot the gun on it. And different crops were different times and so on like that. Thought it was pretty interesting. I looked into it, and sure enough, and of course Farmer's Almanac, and it had to do with Ben Franklin and all those things, so that was kind of blowing me away with all the stuff you start to find out about that. But it goes way back when people and farmers were figuring these things out into what time of the year, because I noticed something on this ranch myself. When we were sowing fields of Sudan and hay, it was supposed to have been done right through a certain amount of time. And we only had a few tractors with big sowers on the back of them that could do these fields, and these were huge. And so it would happen over the process of 2 weeks, and we really, 3 or 4 days before would hit it and then go through the whole thing and end up being somewhat late. And sure enough, you could tell the ones that were actually hitting right on the date they were supposed to be were much better. I thought of it along the lines of these guys who could, when a woman would say, I missed my period, and they check you out, and then they go, okay, when was the period? And they were like, da-da-da, and they go, okay, you're going to have the baby about November 14th to 16th, and da-da-da-da, and you're like, how do you figure that crap out? Well, there's a gestation period going on. Things that people have figured out a long time ago. Here's an ancient fire pit, and you can see the drag in the back of it where it would actually be able to helpful breathe, and then they'd also drag ashes out of it. But this is an ancient oven, and so here's another evidence at the site. So these are all right there with each other. If you were going to try to write it off, you would maybe find something 200 yards away, and still if it was 200 yards away, then you'd say, well, that circle's still over there, so everybody's living here but knows about that. And if you wanted to call it graveyard, then they're living there, and there's the graveyard, or the ceremonial thing. Everybody's not living on it, they're living over here. And so how far would you have to have somebody get away before you wouldn't associate it? Looks like a mile or two, wasn't it? Then again, we know at Stonehenge people traversed the whole thing all the way to it, so no, not necessarily. Be amazed to actually be a fly on the wall and find out where people and how far distance they came to this site during certain times of the year to find out exactly whenever everything was going on. So is this an open air agri-temple? The site was occupied from around 6,000 years ago in the Neolithic early Bronze Age, and remained so through the Iron Age and into the Anglo-Saxon times. Therefore, the researchers think the site greatly broadens the understanding of how the surrounding landscape was used and lived in during this time period. But the archaeologists are working against the clock. See, planning consent was given to the construction company Dendera, like Dendera from Egypt, but it's not, from a new building at the site. So for a new building at the site. So they've been giving a permit to be able to do this, but the consent was given with the condition that an archaeological dig was to take place with the findings recorded before construction could start. So what does that mean? Well, I'm sure to them at the first part, they didn't have any problem scouring the ground for them because it looked like they had a little something there and wanted to check out what it was. And you can imagine people that have something set up like this really get ticked off whenever the dig goes on, and then all of a sudden they find these other things, and then this big sacred circle that actually may negate your site somewhat. But I don't know what's left of the site and if it should be done that way in any way, but it should surely be completely documented. So their Walmart gets delayed for a couple of years here now, and that can't be fantastic for them, but humanity is. Chris Higgins from Dendera said that it's great to have an advanced understanding of such key periods of history adding this is a unique opportunity to appreciate the historical importance of the site, what then might have occurred at the site when it was operating as a temple. You know, everybody always says everything's a temple, everything's a temple. Well, if you look at the actual root word of it, then it kind of makes sense somewhat, regardless of what it is, but always this bigger, better structure where it looked like people could do certain things at, always got locked up to that, whether that was astronomical or other places. The word temple is chosen carefully, for while you might associate the term with sacred buildings, this was not always what the word represented. The word, from the Latin templum, consecrated piece of ground, only later become a building for the worship of God. Yeah, and so if somebody was buried there in ancient times, or perhaps if somebody started doing some work in a place where they figured out and they found some caveman kind of thing, dinosaur, who knows what, that could be looked at that too. They'd be like, oh, there's something going on here. And then consecrated because of that situation. Templum comes from that idea, and Templar comes from that idea. A lot of people say the word temporary and so on comes from roots that have the same gestating meaning. And then the word temp-el is actually like the temporary dwelling of El, the god, and that he's no longer there. And if you look into it, El dwelled in a tent. And so there wouldn't be much left of that, would there? But that's for other videos. Sacred rites of farming. The cults, rituals, rites of magic in early farming communities emerge in the early Holocene period between 8,000 down to about 3,000 BC. Unlike the Paleolithic and Mesolithic periods from prehistory, the Neolithic period was characterized by the climatic conditions very similar to those of the present, not really, that directed human activity chiefly to the soil and its fruits. Well, you know, right now we're really not doing that bad if you come to find out what they went through and their massive droughts. If we went through a situation like that in modern times, it would screw up the whole world. It's tried to do it quite a few times on us, but because we have modern shipping methods of getting things around, we're able to do that. Canning and shipping and so on has really been able to save some people's life, along with modern medicine. Without that situation going on, a lot of these people would have died off, gone through all kinds of problems, might have caused a sickness that took them out. In the process of us trying to save them, broke out in everybody and took everybody almost out. There's a million scenarios of what if, but this Holocene period coming into it at the Younger Dryas event really was a catastrophic event, and everybody says, oh, well, that's what did it and kicked them all in and so on, and then they kind of use a key point of Göbekli Tepe and say so. But I ask you, if you look at Göbekli Tepe and its circles, which is like this circle here, does that look like the first time they ever tried to do anything like it, or it was somehow brand new they were practicing, or anything like that? I've heard people say because there's a bunch of circles there that they were practicing, or they were wrong, or they were this, or they were that. We need to excavate a whole lot more before people start assuming out of it more than that. But they're still lined up today, so it wasn't like they went out of vogue. But as they went through the different calendar times, it may have changed the majority of a temple. So there might have been one for Scorpio and Aries, so on, you know. Of course, back then we were looking, more Scorpio and so on, and the Wayback Machine before Taurus. And it got buried over, and it just became this mound. And what's under this mound right over here? Well, look what's under this little mound right over here that people have been farming on top of, but it has this thing that doesn't stick up like Stonehenge, but it was used just like it thousands of years. You try to compare something that people went through back then and their super hardships and so on to what we're going on now, and that's, I think, in my mind, disgusting that people are all pulling this bullshit and acting like the world's going to end in 12 years. Well, now it's 8, now it's 6, now, well, it already happened, according to Gore and a few other guys, and no, it didn't happen. You know, what do you, well, if I fearmonger, then we could get more control over people. You know, well, no, we definitely built this on the idea of you're not going to act like that. Imagine just about 6-8 years ago if you were like old enough to realize what was going on, and then to see the shift that's gone all of a sudden now. Lord knows what will be like 10-15 years looking back on. You remember? Never mind. Having emerged from hundreds of thousands of years of stone tool production while inhabiting caves for the longest time, humans most probably ritualized, maybe even worshipped, stones and their associated spirits or deities. But in the Neolithic period, humans shifted their supernatural focus to the earth and her, or an earth mother, ability to reproduce life and sustaining crops. I wouldn't necessarily say that one was without the other until that point. Also, they talk about inhabiting caves, but if that was the truth, there wouldn't only be 132 sites that have cave occupation at some certain time over the last 50,000 years. And luckily, because of being trapped in that environment, we get a couple of skeletons. If they were constantly used, they would have been full up and out the door with skeletons. It actually is more of a rarity. Maybe something to contact the other world and the underworld, to get into a cave and do this ritual so it makes the plants sprout up, so it pushes up daisies. A whole lot more than you're giving credit for. And all of a sudden there was a her. I don't believe that. I believe there was the sacred power of her from way back. I'm going to give it 30 to 50,000 years easy. But that's from other researchers and looking back at the Wayback Machine and just thoughts and conjecture and philosophy on that concept and idea. And all we have is little scraps of wood and a needle in a haystack, and all of a sudden we came up with all this BS out of that. But it seems somewhat secure. Here we have on a coast and a coastline Skara Brae and its little setups that go on here, and circles that are going around, circle, circle, circle. And isn't that much like a lot of temples that we see on the island of Malta and so on, which look a lot like the circles of Göbekli Tepe? Are there any T-pillars in here? No, we're on past that. Apparently we don't have to do the T thing anymore. Still in there somewhat. And there are some giant stones that are mixed in with this. But if you can find readily flat stones, and all you have to do is cut the ends off of them to links and link them up like bricks, that's a little bit easier. It's kind of Hobbitville, if you will. Notice how the sand of time have gone over the top of it, and then it's grown that beach grass that everybody knows from golf courses and so on up over the top of it. Always thought of this as like, that's kind of a Hobbiton kind of idea. So with agriculture came a more settled lifestyle. Sites of permanent occupation were built in the most abundant flat landscapes. The process of domesticating seeds, plants, and animals brought about pottery making, dairy farming, and advancements in salt and smoke preservation methods. Man, they found stuff that looks like they were doing a beef jerky type of stuff about 34,000 years ago. Looks like they were hanging a rack and doing something up. There's no way they were using this to spit the thing across, unless you want to give them a Fred Flintstone concept. They were just hanging it up so the smoke constantly went over it, so it kept the bugs off of it as it dehydrated and made beef jerky. Collectively, this is referred as a Neolithic revolution, and the site at Biddenham represents this new shift in thinking. Here, the old deities who were perceived as governing the elements that most affected successful crop production were worshipped. Well, you know, if we look back in it correctly, you can see that there was this Sky Father concept that a lot of people had, and an Earth Mother, and they got together. In fact, that's in your Bible, and the very first thing, he's hovering over the waters. Mary, maritime. God's face hovered over Mary. It made Jesus eventually. There's a bunch of stuff to that. I shouldn't even go there right now. But that concept is a sexual connotation of creation. And it's echoed not from that. That's just an echo of all these other talkings about that were like this. And you end up getting gods and goddesses of grain because they're going to help make you the abundance, and so on. And it's all just aspects of sun worship. Always was. And in fact, whenever people think nowadays that it was something more than that it really never was, even if you think that it was to the people at that time. If you follow me. So even if you think that they thought all this was going on and the planets were little stars going around, well, because it's called planet, means wandering star, and then eventually found out, well, those aren't stars, there's only one star. Monastery, what does monastery mean? It means one star. They're worshiping one star. What's that star? Well, Jesus is the sun god. It brings it all the way back. Did they really have to bring it all the way back, or were some people pretty cognizant of the whole situation all the time? And there never really was this thought you were going to fall off the end of the world. It's flat. You know, I start to believe that there are more people now believing the world was flat than there ever was. So they go on and tell you, and in this case, the ever-changing systems of worship seem to work because the firming site and ceremonial center was occupied from Neolithic right through the Anglo-Saxon times. So even though there were a bunch of different types of worship, until a much more modern times, this circle worked for everybody. This Neolithic circle, let's go to the top kind of real quick. Here's the fireplace. Here's the Pac-Man pits. That's Iron Age. Oh, the schist disc of Sabu. Yeah, they built that by pounding on rocks, by the way. Right. So these sacred circles that worked for everybody way back when ended up working till a modern time, until we got past the point of having to have it. Compasses are still used, and in fact the ideals that are built into this can get you around maritime as well as looking at the cosmos, which they work together along with a sextant and the whole idea. You have to be able to understand 3D geometry kind of situations, though, but it's not that difficult if someone explains it to you. Probably should look into it if you're real interested, or if you plan on taking a sailboat trip somewhere, or even any kind of boat trip. But I still see that square that's inside the circle that's here, and I wonder if that has anything to do with it, and if it has this type of hookup. Again, whenever I first looked at this, they weren't lining up real good. But then I started to see, oh, they're just offshooting each other, and they're digging through the sides of it. So they're digging right next to it over, and then coming through the stratigraphy of the layers of time in a different way. It looks like from here. As soon as they come out with more on this, I'll come out with more on this too. But also, I just wonder how they lay out as corresponding to each other, how close they were. Surely they didn't overlap and on top of it in any way, but the fact that they wanted to hover next to it, even though they were totally separate societies, shows you that they really weren't that separate of society. There were interconnections, and something just like a wristwatch is going to be used for a whole long time. Whenever I started seeing digital watches whenever I was a kid, I go, people are going to lose the whole idea of how to tell time one of these days. But could you go outside and stick a stick in the ground and start telling time? Could you make your own calendar versus the one that's been created to symbolize everything? That's based on sacred geometry, time, space, measurements. It's quite incredible. And also, it's more incredible the more we find out that people knew about this way back when. Like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. And let me know what y'all think about this. And if you know about anything more of it, or if you can find the actual geological paper, archaeological papers that go along with this. But again, this is a preliminary finding, and I don't think they have much yet. I think it's about to come out, and this was the little prelim. Boom! Somebody opened the door and threw a firework out just to wake everybody up. Here's something. Wonder what else they'll find here, but then again, they don't have all the time in the world. So this becomes one of those sites where they basically had to do a quickie on it to figure out what it was all about, and then I'm guessing now it's got something, shopping center built up on it. Peace.